You have to pay for the extra legroom, sir. Being old isn't an excuse. The gate agent rolled her eyes. It was a practiced gesture, sharpened by 11 years of dealing with late departures and overbooked flights. 200 people watched. She didn't lower her voice, didn't pull him aside, didn't offer a single moment of privacy to a man who was already holding himself upright on 2 aluminum crutches in the middle of a crowded, humid terminal. His name was Harold Becker, 92 years old. His left knee had been replaced twice, his right hip once, and his spine was a roadmap of surgical steel. All of it stemmed from damage that had begun on a jagged, frozen ridge outside the Chosin Reservoir in December of 1950. He didn't volunteer that information. He never did. He simply stood there, his knuckles white against the grips of his crutches, holding his duffel bag by a single strap. He explained in a voice that hadn't raised itself in decades, a voice that sounded like gravel grinding over silk. I physically cannot bend my knee, miss. If I sit in a standard seat, I will block the aisle. It is a safety hazard for the others. Diane Marsh, gate agent, Meridian Airways, looked at him the way people look at a slow-loading web page. To her, he wasn't a man. He was a logistical error. Not my problem, she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the airport like a blade. Policy is policy. First class and economy plus are sold out. Go to the back of the plane or don't fly. I have a line behind you. She reached across the counter and grabbed his duffel bag without asking, intending to tag it for the cargo hold. Harold didn't resist. His hands released the strap slowly, the way a man does when he's decided that fighting over luggage is beneath the dignity of the life he has lived. But as she pulled the bag toward the conveyor belt, the zipper, worn thin by decades of use, caught on the edge of the scale. The bag hit the belt hard. A small velvet box, navy blue, edges worn white at the corners, tumbled out from the front pocket. It bounced once on the black rubber, then it fell. The metal hit the floor with a sound that didn't belong in an airport. It wasn't a clatter. It wasn't a crash. It was something in between, a heavy, resonant thud followed by a metallic ring that seemed to vibrate through the linoleum floor. It was the sound of old metal that had traveled a very long distance, through fire and ice, to end up on the floor of a terminal named after no one important. Captain James Calloway was walking out of the jet bridge to get his 3rd coffee of the morning. He heard it. The sound stopped him mid-stride. In his 22 years of flying and 4 years in the academy, Calloway had learned that certain sounds carried weight. This wasn't the sound of a dropped coin or a keychain. He stopped. He looked down at the metal lying on the floor. He looked up at the man on crutches, whose face remained a mask of quiet, stoic endurance. Then he looked back down. Calloway walked over, slowly. He didn't rush, but there was a sudden, absolute gravity in his movement. His uniform was pressed, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He crouched down, his knees popping, a sound Harold Becker likely recognized. Calloway picked up the metal with both hands. Not one, both, as if he were handling a living thing. He turned it over and read the inscription on the back. He didn't say anything for a long time. The terminal around them seemed to mute. The frantic energy of Gate 14B died away as the captain stood up, his face ashen, and held the metal out to Harold. Harold took it with a steady hand. He tucked it back into the velvet box. He tucked the box back into his bag. His face didn't change, but his eyes, clear, watery blue, locked onto Calloway's for a fraction of a second. The inscription on the back of that metal read, Spec, for Harold R. Becker, Chosin Reservoir, North Korea, December 24th, 1950. Christmas Eve. Calloway stood at the edge of the gate area, his coffee forgotten on a nearby ledge. He watched Harold Becker. The metal's edge had scratches on it. Not from being dropped today. These were old scratches, worn smooth by time. The kind of scratches that happen when something rides in a bag for 74 years through the ordinary violence of a life lived without ceremony. Calloway knew that metal. He had seen a photograph of it exactly once. It had been tucked into the hidden flap of his father's wallet, kept behind a picture of his mother. But Calloway's face had changed. The professional mask of a pilot had been replaced by the raw, focused intensity of a sun. The Silver Star is not a participation ribbon. It is the 3rd highest military decoration the United States can give a soldier. It is awarded for one thing and one thing only, gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Not courage under pressure. Not years of faithful service. Gallantry. In action. The kind of gallantry that gets witnessed by other men who are also trying not to die in a place where the air itself feels like broken glass. Raymond Calloway, James's father, didn't talk about the Korean War the way some men did. There were no bumper stickers on his truck, no VFW hats in the closet. He kept the war in a small, locked room in his mind. But once a year, on December 24th, he told the story. James was 12 the first time he sat through it at the kitchen table in their house outside Nashville. His mother was washing dishes, her back turned, but her shoulders were always tight. The television was off. His father held a mug of coffee he never drank and spoke in the same voice he used for everything, even measured, without decoration. "The frozen chosen," his father would whisper. The unit had moved into a sector near the reservoir at 400. The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed through the mountain passes, carrying the scent of snow and cordite. Intelligence said the Chinese army was miles away. Intelligence was wrong. The ambush came from the ridges. It was midnight, Christmas Eve. The ground was so frozen they couldn't dig foxholes. They had to hide behind frozen equipment and the bodies of the fallen. Raymond had taken shrapnel through his right thigh and around through his shoulder. He went down in the open, 14 feet of frozen, wind-swept ground between him and the nearest dugout. He remembered lying there, his blood turning to slush on the ice, watching the stars and doing the math. 14 feet, 2 machine guns. The math didn't work. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but just to stop seeing the cold sky. Then something grabbed his collar. It wasn't a gentle grip. It was the grip of someone who had decided that death was going to have to wait. He was dragged across the frozen shale, the jagged rocks tearing at his uniform. He kept his eyes on the face of the man dragging him. A kid, maybe 19, his jaw set like poured concrete, his own breath coming in ragged, frozen plumes. The kid wasn't looking at Raymond. He was looking at the ridge, calculating, moving, ignoring the red stain spreading down his own left pant leg where a bullet had found him minutes before. They made it to cover. The young soldier checked Raymond's wound with numb fingers, said, "You'll keep," in the same tone someone uses to assess a fence post, and turned back toward the fire. "You're hit," Raymond had gasped, pointing at the kid's knee. The kid looked down at the blood freezing on his fatigues. "Yeah," he said. That was all. He turned back to the fight. His name, Raymond learned it weeks later in a hospital ship, was Harold Becker, Specialist 4th Class, from a small town in eastern Tennessee. James Calloway had heard this story every year for 40 years. He heard it the last time in a hospital room in Nashville in 2019, while machines beeped at irregular intervals and his father's voice had thinned to something barely above a whisper. "If you ever meet him," Raymond had said, his eyes unfocused but his grip on James's hand surprisingly strong, "you shake his hand for me. Both of yours. You understand? Both hands." James had nodded. He had spent the next 5 years wondering if Harold Becker was still alive, or if he had passed into the quiet history of the forgotten war. He wasn't forgotten. He was standing 20 feet away, repositioning his aluminum crutches, preparing to walk to the back of a plane because a woman with a lanyard didn't like his knees. Calloway walked back to the jet bridge door. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene the way Diane Marsh had made a scene, loudly, without embarrassment, in front of 200 people who hadn't asked to witness it. He found his first officer inside the cockpit, running through the pre-departure checklist. "I need 10 minutes, Calloway said. The first officer looked up. He read his captain's face, a face that looked like it had been carved out of the same Tennessee limestone as the man at the gate. He didn't ask questions. 10 minutes, he repeated. Calloway walked back out to the gate. Diane Marsh was already moving on. She was scanning a boarding pass for a man in a tailored suit, smiling the corporate-approved smile. The Harold Becker situation had been filed away, a small indignity dispensed without weight. Calloway stopped at her station. "Seat 2A, he said. "Who's in 2A? Diane blinked, her smile faltering. "That's Mr. Marcus Webb. He's a Meridian Platinum Elite member, Captain. He specifically requested the window because I need 2A held for a different passenger." Diane's expression shifted into that specific shape of a person about to explain a policy to someone they believe is beneath it. "Captain, we can't simply move a Platinum member. The manifest is locked. Mr. Webb has a board meeting in New York and he—" "This is not a policy conversation, Diane." His voice was the same volume as hers, but it had the temperature of the chosen reservoir. I am the commanding officer of this aircraft. I am telling you that seat 2A needs to be made available, and the gentleman with the crutches who was just directed to the rear needs to be brought back to this counter. Now!" Silence fell over the gate, the kind of silence that happens when the person in charge finally speaks. "Call your station manager," Calloway added. "While you're at it." Marcus Webb was 44 years old. He was the vice president of something important at a pharmaceutical firm. He had 41 first-class flights this year. He was already settled into 2A, jacket folded, sparkling water on the tray, when the flight attendant delivered the news. Webb walked to the front of the jet bridge with the energy of a man who had filed many successful complaints. "I have a confirmed booking," Webb said, looking at Calloway. "I'd like an explanation for why I'm being removed from my seat." Calloway looked at Webb, at the expensive watch, the smooth hands, the indignation of a man who had never known a minute of true cold. "Mr. Webb, I'm Captain James Calloway, pilot in command. I've asked that your seat be reassigned. On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I said so," Calloway said. "The gate agent will help you rebook. There's another flight in 3 hours. You'll be in New York by dinner." Webb's jaw moved, but no words came out. He looked at the captain's eyes and realized this wasn't a negotiation. He turned and walked back into the terminal, the sound of his rolling carry-on fading into the carpet. Calloway turned to the young gate agent standing beside Diane. "Where is Mr. Becker?" Harold was at the far end of the terminal. He was sitting on a hard plastic chair. His crutches leaned parallel against the seat beside him. His duffel was on his lap. He was looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the tarmac, at the fuel trucks, the ground crew, the gray morning pressing flat against the glass. He wasn't on a phone. He wasn't reading. He was just waiting, like a man who had learned that time is something you endure, not something you spend. The young gate agent approached him carefully. "Mr. Becker, Captain Calloway has requested you come back to the counter, sir." Harold looked at him. Then he looked across the terminal at the counter, where Diane stood very still and a woman in a station manager's lanyard had appeared. He picked up his crutches. He didn't ask why. He just moved. The walk took a while. His left leg set its own terms and he honored them. By the time he reached the counter, the gate area had gone quiet. Station manager Patricia Okafor spoke first. "Mr. Becker, I want to offer you a direct apology on behalf of Meridian Airways. What happened here was not acceptable. It was a failure of our values." Harold nodded once, a nod that acknowledged the words without necessarily forgiving the act. Patricia turned toward Diane. Diane's hand was shaking as she reached for the intercom handset. The PA system clicked on, that hollow, echoing sound. "Attention all passengers at Gate 14B, Diane's voice came through. It was smaller now, shrillness replaced by a thin, brittle shame. "My name is Diane Marsh. I handled the boarding for this flight. I spoke to one of our passengers in a way that was disrespectful and unacceptable. I dismissed a physical limitation that was significant. I am sorry. To Mr. Becker directly, I am sorry." She hung up the handset. The terminal was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Then, an older man in a John Deere cap near the window put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. One sharp, clear note. Then he started clapping. It spread. It wasn't the polite applause of a theater. It was the rhythmic, heavy clapping of people who had just seen something right happen in a world that usually goes the other way. Harold stood at the counter. He looked at Diane directly. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, flat and clean. Then he waited to board. Seat 2A was wide enough that Harold could extend his leg. He settled his crutches along the wall. The flight attendant brought him water, setting it down with both hands. She didn't say, "Thank you for your service." She just looked him in the eye and nodded. It was better that way. Then the jet bridge door opened and Calloway stepped through. He didn't go to the cockpit. He sat down in the aisle seat next to Harold. "My father's name was Raymond Calloway," the captain said. "Sergeant, 1st Cavalry, Chosin Reservoir. Christmas Eve, 1950. Harold's hands, resting on his duffel bag, went very still. "He told me the story every year," Calloway said. "The 14 feet of ice. The 19-year-old kid who didn't know how to quit. He kept a photograph of your medal in his wallet every day from 1951 until the day he died in 2019. Harold looked at the captain. For the first time, the stoic mask softened. Something moved behind his eyes, the ghost of a 19-year-old boy who had once been very, very cold. "Raymond," Harold whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. He lived a good life, Mr. Becker. He married my mother. He had 3 kids. He coached baseball for 11 years. He grew the best tomatoes in Nashville. Calloway's jaw tightened. He called it the best life a man could ask for. And he knew exactly who gave it to him. Harold looked out the window at the gray sky. I wondered about him, he said softly. I wondered if he made it all the way home. He made it all the way home, Calloway said. The captain reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph. It was worn at the edges, creased twice across the middle. He held it out. Harold unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was the silver star, centered on a dark background, slightly blurry, taken by a cheap camera in the 50s, carried for a lifetime. He carried this, Harold said. Every day. Harold held it out to return it, but Calloway shook his head. Keep it, sir. It belongs with the original. Harold folded the photograph along its original creases and placed it in the velvet box alongside his medal. Calloway stood. He straightened his jacket. He extended his right hand. Harold took it. Then Calloway covered Harold's hand with his left. Both hands, just as his father had asked. 3 seconds of contact that spanned 74 years. Then Calloway turned and walked to the cockpit. There is a version of this story that ends with the numbers. The video of Diane's apology, 8 million views. Meridian Airways stock, a blip on the radar. Marcus Webb's LinkedIn post about leadership and humility. Shared 100,000 times before people realized he was the one who got kicked off. But Harold Becker doesn't care about the numbers. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Harold's house in eastern Tennessee. It was 4 pages of blue ink on plain white paper. From James Calloway. It told Harold that Raymond had once repaired a rocking chair for James's mother so precisely that you couldn't find the break unless you knew where to look. It told him that Raymond had tried to find Harold in the 70s and 90s, but the records were messy and the town was small. James wrote, he stopped looking because he didn't want to impose a debt on you. He realized that a man who does what you did doesn't want to be thanked. But I am not my father. I am the son who got to grow up because you turned around. The letter ended with, he never forgot you. Not for a single Christmas Eve in 74 years. Harold read the letter on his porch. The Tennessee morning was quiet. This is not a story about an airline or a viral video. It is a story about what happens when a man spends his entire life doing the right thing in the dark. No camera, no audience, just 14 feet of frozen ground and a man who was one of his own. Raymond Calloway grew tomatoes because Harold Becker turned around on an icy ridge. James Calloway flew 22 years because Harold Becker turned around. A rocking chair sat in a living room for decades because Harold Becker turned around. None of that is in a database. All of it is real. Diane Marsh is in a back office now, filing papers. Marcus Webb is in another board meeting, perhaps a little quieter than he used to be. Harold Becker got 2 eggs over easy at his favorite diner. He got a grandson who listens when he talks. And he got a velvet box that is finally, after 7 decades, completely full. Do the right thing in the dark. Without expectation. Because 74 years later, on a linoleum floor in a terminal named after no one important, it will land with a sound. And someone who needed to hear it will be standing close enough to listen. If Harold's story stayed with you, share it. These are the stories worth keeping.